you have to be willing to be more in love with the people than the vision of what you think the church should become. Like, you come in with so much excitement. You're like, yes, Lord, you give me a vision of what the church could be. Oh, I can see it. Let's put it to work. And I'm driven. So I could be like, that's the plan. So in the next month, we've got to change that. And I'm like, but for the well-being of the people, that ain't good. The dream is not better than the people. Like, you have to be willing to be like, my role is to serve them well. And I got to realize those people in that church have a journey. And my role as a pastor is to come alongside that journey with them. And even though I know it would be great, but it might take 10 years, and I should be good with that.
Hey friends, Jordan here. Every time we release an episode of The Pastorate, our prayer is the same, that it would breathe life into the places that you lead from. Not just your calendar or your strategy, but your soul. So thanks for taking the time. We're grateful that you're here. Today's episode is a little different. Instead of one long-form interview, you'll hear segments from 3 shorter conversations, each one with a Canadian lead pastor. We recorded these conversations in person at our lead pastor's retreat at Barnabas Landing last month, and we decided to bring them together into one episode because, side by side, they offer something quite special. Each voice you'll hear in this episode brings something distinct, shaped by a different region, a different story, and a different church context. One pastor's in a coastal town, another in the heart of Quebec, and another in suburban British Columbia. And yet, beneath all those differences is a shared calling to faithfully shepherd people, to love the church, and to give their lives to the work of leading communities towards Jesus. Their contexts may differ, but the weight that they carry and the grace that they rely on is deeply familiar to every pastor listening. In a time when ministry can feel isolating, it felt important for us to lean into the uniqueness of our Canadian landscape and to give voice to pastors who, simply by sharing their stories, can remind us that we're in it together. To begin, we'll jump into the middle of a conversation between Jason and Joe Jung, the pastor of Town and Field Church in Langley. Joe spent years as a public school teacher before sensing a call into vocational ministry, a shift that wasn't always clear, but one that God had been preparing him for all along. As you listen, pay attention to how Joe talks about obedience, discernment, and the way that God often equips us long before we understand the assignment. Particularly compelling is the way that Joe talks about what it looks like for his family to participate in God's call together. Here's Joe and Jason.
One of the reasons why I was excited to chat is one of the things that caused us to start the Pastorate in the first place was an awareness that we need more pastors that are called, equipped to serve the church in Canada. And so part of it is like, how do we create longevity? And so pastoral health is important. But another piece of the equation so I think a lot about this puzzle of, where are pastors for the church of tomorrow going to come from? And you might look at the Bible colleges, and there's been some research done and going like, hey, there's not enough people coming through that system to meet the need. And one of the cool things that I've seen God do is call people from other careers into the pastoral vocation. And that's a really special gift because they come with a different lens, a different set of skills and experience. And so one of the reasons why I was excited to chat with you is because that is part of your story. And so when you said yes to that job, did you see that as, hey, this is a step that I think God's in? Or was that like, oh, I'm on a totally different career trajectory now? Like, how were you discerning that? Was this like, oh, I'm moving from one path to pastoral ministry? Or I'm like, for whatever reason, God's just, this may be a pit stop.
Yeah, I think that's the second is how I see my life and how I've learned to see it, that rather than the God's will for my life is this thing that he'll lay out for me and say, in 5-year plan, 10-year plan, whatever, that more like he's literally going to tell me, turn left, turn right. He's sitting with me. I think it was Blackaby that gave that analogy of like, he's in the passenger seat with you and he's just telling you drive. And when it's time to turn, he'll tell you because he knows where to go. And so that's just how I've always viewed being obedient to God's will. It's not, I need to know now, God, what's going to happen, but like whatever you tell me to do next is what I will do, and I will be obedient. I think the scary thing for me in the thought of like being in a ministry and then even stepping into a role of a pastor, and now I'm in a lead pastor role, was this idea of like, am I equipped? It's one thing to be called. It's one thing to feel like God is asking me to do this. It's another to feel like, am I able to do this? Am I equipped to do this? And so no, and initially it was really just, I'm being obedient. I felt like I was supposed to apply. Then I felt like I was supposed to take the job if it was offered to me, step into the role, not knowing what it meant. In hindsight now, and it's still, I mean, still really new for me. But in hindsight, if I look back over the past 4 years, it's really clear that this is where God has called me to be, and this is what God's called me to do. And the crazy thing is that it's actually what He's been equipping me to do for my whole life.
That is kind of a fun way to look at our lives, to say, if it's true that we can look back and see how He's prepared, it brings a lot of meaning to our experiences today because of just the redemptive potential of it.
Absolutely.
How's this affected your family? Like moving into ministry, your wife's called Andrea, right?
Yes.
Like that wasn't part of the deal when you guys got married, that she was in a ministry family.
Absolutely not.
And obviously you discern this stuff together,
Yeah.
but with her and your kiddos, like tell me about that journey of moving from, and I know that every career has its own challenges. Your wife's a nurse, that has its own implications on family, but you moving into a ministry life, how's that been for the family to adapt to together?
Yeah, absolutely. Like in Korean culture, I grew up in Korean churches, and the context, there's actually a word for a pastor's wife. It's actually like its own title. Like in English, we don't have a word for it, but it's actually like the first lady. It's an actual role.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of expectation that comes along with that. And my wife's half Greek, half Italian, but she came, when she first came to Christ, she actually came to church with me and into this Korean church context. So this is the idea and the understanding she has. And I think she would say that that's not what she wanted. The role that she necessarily wanted was to be the pastor's wife. But the amazing thing is, like, again, it's the same thing when I look back on my life, when I look back on her life and the way God has equipped her, everything about how she is, who she is, what God's brought her through, how He has just shaped her and molded her, and the grace that He's put upon her has, I feel like, made it like perfect fit for this. Like, as somebody who loves me and supports me, she's amazing. Like I would be in a completely different place if she was not with me, if God had not put her with me in this journey. I don't think I'd be able to do it. And it's just a blessing that she's there with me, but also with the church. Like, she's just such an amazing presence. She has so many gifts and natural abilities that I don't have. And her temperament, her personality is so caring, so hospitable. So, like, at the core of who she is a person who cares and loves and journeys alongside with people. And so that's just been amazing. It's also and equipped her in so many ways. And so she's, I think, really learned to appreciate what this means for our family. And our kids too have just really jumped in.
How old are your kiddos?
We have 14 and 11, two boys. And they've really like just jumped in and embraced this. And I actually asked them, I'm like, hey, do you feel any pressure? Because you're the pastor's, kids. And they're like, no. So
That's
like, okay,
great.
good. Maybe you should feel a little pressure.
Yeah, my kids are probably
through.
like yours, where I'm like, I don't want them to feel pressure, but it's like, guys, like,
don't do anything crazy.
Don't be so casual all the time.
A little bit of pressure is okay. But no, they're totally into it. And my wife actually had this conversation with my kids, and just this shift over this last little while of them going from thinking, okay, dad or husband is in this new role, and so we're going with him to this new church, into this new life, into this ministry. And it is different because any other job, of course, she's not involved in my career or my life, and I'm not involved.
You're not going to hospital every Sunday to walk around with her.
I don't really interact with her coworkers, but my family is actually being the church with the church that I'm leading, and that's a whole different thing. But instead of thinking that like they come along with us because God's called me to this church, my wife asked my son, do you think maybe part of the reason why God has called dad to this church is because he wanted us to be a part of this church. And my son said, yeah. And so I think both of them, like my wife and my kids, are just seeing it as like, this is not just God's calling on my life that they're being brought into. Like God had a calling for them to be a part of this community in this specific way. And it's been such a blessing that's happened.
I'm so glad to hear that. You're 6 months into the job, lead pastor. What are you enjoying the most?
Preaching. So it's, if you ask me what is the most difficult,
Yeah.
it's preaching every week. And what am I enjoying the most? It's preaching. It's just the way that God's wired me. The careers that I did kind of choose and go into had to do with like just teaching and making things understandable. But in teaching, I was in the public school system, and I hit a point where it was wonderful, and I got to like pour into kids and be there. But I hit a point where I was like, the most important thing that I believe that I can give to them, I can't in this context. And so now I feel like a huge part of my job is to be able to use my natural inclinations and wiring in being able to communicate truth, and like loving doing that, but being able to do that with absolute truth, with the most important, powerful thing in the world, is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's like, I feel like I get paid to do this. This is I get to paid now to like study the Bible and to like exposit and to like then preach the word of God. Like it feels like such a privilege. And so I'm loving it the most, but it's also the hardest part of what I'm doing.
Somebody said recently, I'm sure many people have said something like this, like preaching's always like a death and a resurrection, and you experience all of it.
Absolutely.
And some of the death is happening sometimes Friday, sometimes Saturday.
Absolutely.
Depends where you are in the process.
Yeah.
This is so encouraging for me, man, just to reconnect with you, to hear the story. I just thank God for the way he's working through your life. I love the church you're part of. I'm just thrilled for your family, for you, for them. And so thanks for taking time to chat with us today. It's been really encouraging.
You're very welcome.
Next, we head east to Montreal, where Jason sat down with Ben Carbone, the lead pastor of Église MCI, or MCI Church for us Anglophones. Ben's story is a powerful one. He recently stepped into the role of lead pastor, following in the footsteps of his father, who founded the church and faithfully pastored it for nearly 50 years. That kind of generational transition brings with it both a rich inheritance and a real pressure. In this section of the conversation, Ben opens up about identity, about comparison, and learning to lead from who God made him to be, not just replicating what came before. He also shares candidly about the emotional weight of succession and the grace needed to carry that mantle well. Here's Ben and Jason.
Tell me about the transition. Now you're lead pastor of a church. You transitioned from your dad. Yep. Tell me a bit about that part of the story.
I mean, it was a lot of, obviously preparation, conversation, talking. We did, it was in the back of our mind for sure. The moment I said, hey, I want to be in ministry, it's like, good, that'll be great. So we planned it out. My dad also, I think when he saw that moment for the culture of our church, or now personality, because they never had another lead pastor than my dad. So you kind of get accustomed to familiarity with it. So they already having a transition is a big thing. When it's almost 50 years you had the same guy leading the church. And so we've talked about it, made a plan. We had a conversation to be like, okay, it's happening. But I had to sit down and be like, so when it's happening? When's the date? Because it gets more real. Like talking about it's one thing. Then you put a date. So the moment we talk and put a date was like a 2-year period. But during that time, knowing we have really different personalities, it couldn't just be like, take the same church as it is. And also because we came back after 5 years of being in Australia, for me, I've changed a lot. And the church has changed a lot. It's not the same church I left than when I came back in. It's the people have the same name. They look quite similar, but they're not the same people. I've grown in my studies. They've grown in their own journeys. So I had to relearn who those people are.
It's almost like, and to love them, like you always love them, but then like these people have changed. Like loving them looks like going on that journey with them.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, transition, put a date, going through it, doing our best. But then what was really good is that my parents were committed to do whatever it takes to make that transition easy, whatever it takes.
Wow.
To the point where we changed the whole church structure, knowing that the way I was wired was so different from my dad.
Wow. What were some of the examples? And like the I guess context being there's lots of ways to structure a church. And I love that it was like, hey, let's structure this in a way that's going to set it up for success in its next chapter. What were some of the things that you identified that could be changed or should be changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and my parents are like, I call them a real power couple, okay? Like they're so complementary in the way they lead, and they lead together, really. But, you know, my dad is like visionary, optimist, yeah, that's right. And like just can pop ideas every day, you know? Let's do a journal, let's do a magazine, let's go there. And the culture of the church was like, let's go, let's do it, you know? I'm a little bit more like, let's get this thing structured a little bit more. Like, let's get a system going. Let's get a little bit more organized in some areas. But so, because when I was seeing the way he was doing it, I'm like, I know I won't last long if I step into this like that.
That's a lot of wisdom. Like, was that a wrestle for you because self-awareness is such a slow journey and comparison can be a real killer, you know?
Yeah, totally.
What was that journey for you of going, I love my dad, I see the gifts on his life, but I'm not that person, I've got different gifts. Yeah, what was that journey of even that growing in that own self-awareness for you?
That's actually a really good question. I don't know. There's a word that keeps resonating in my heart. Facilitator. How can I explain that? I want to be teachable every time. And that required, I know the only way I can actually grow for the benefit of the church and that the church moves forward is to ask for help. That's it. And that's where the whole helping out with Unstuck, right?
Yeah.
For us, that was big.
That's a group that you work with through some of the transition and some of the work. Okay, cool. To go with that of hey, I want someone from outside to help have a look in, to help us see things that we might not see for ourselves. We're in the aquarium, so sometimes we're so close that it's hard to see what's going on. And to have somebody from outside help you see these things and to have the journey to learn from that. So I think it was that and the deep burden. I just wanted to work. That's it. I couldn't, it's and in a transition, you cannot force people to accept you as their pastor. I kind of accepted that, if that makes sense. So let me try to explain that. I was when I step in, it's my goal, I'm not trying to make people accept me as their pastor the same way they see my dad. If they're journeying with him for 30 years, it's not the next day because you have the title now, suddenly you're the same kind of pastor to them as he was when he gave his life doing this, journeying with them. I didn't do the same journey with them, but I am called not, my goal is not to seek them to be respected or approved or whatever. It's no, I'm there because I want to serve them. I just love the church. I just love the people. And whatever it takes for that church to move forward, that's what I'm saying yes to. And so it's not a mindset of oh, that's my next step in my career, if I can say that. Or in this season, we had a conversation with my wife of a book about the roadmap to character. I think it's a road to character. By David Brooks?
That's right.
It's a beauty.
And there's a part of it that talks about vocation. Instead of being this inner thing that you kind of discover in yourself, being more what is God speaking from outside, saying, what's your role in this environment? Probably also helps you to realize your vocation. And I felt that was something like that, where I'm I could have been anywhere else, but I'm here. Wow. And somehow the gifts and things that God has put into my life seems to be a gift for the people around me. And as long as God wants it, he will facilitate it. And if it changes, it will change. But right now, it's opening a door for that position to be in that place, to speak to those people in that environment. And if I can be a good steward of that, praise God for that. And after that, it changes. Praise God for that too. But yeah, I felt from almost the get-go, even like a month before the transition happened, like I'm on socials, but I'm on social media, but as a ghost, if that makes sense. So it's like I look only to see our church Instagram to be like with the team, hey, that's good, we're going well, you know. But I'm trying not to look to anybody else or to foster anything, just for the sake of my heart. I really, and we've talked about that yesterday night too. I was like, I know my weakness. I'm aware. I'm like, if I look to somebody else, I'll feel a comparison. I feel like I'm not doing good enough. I feel like, oh gosh, everybody's going to look in that and go there. Like there's so many things that's popping in my mind.
It's
I'm
wild.
Like,
the thoughts that come into our mind, the insecurities that mess with us.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's true in any vocation, but I just feel it as a pastor, like,
yeah,
especially the day after church.
Yep.
Totally. We should all make a rule. Just don't go on social media on Monday.
That's right.
It's for the best.
It should be blocked. You should be like in your time management thing on the app, like block on Mondays. Yeah, totally. So I just totally got out and keep it as simple as I can. But the thing that resonated, facilitator, and just being teachable. Always hungry to learn because you're hungry to grow. And that's what I tell to my staff team. And that's what I say to everybody. And I'm like, the moment we stop doing that, we've made a cap on our journey.
Yeah.
Like that's it. Then you can't grow because you're not being teachable. I'm like, the whole idea of being a disciple is that like you're a student for life. And I'm just trying to learn what is God doing in our midst, in that context, with that church, in my life, with my family. And just being, faithful in that, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
You know, growing up around ministry, you're aware of what ministry requires, like pastoring. So in some ways, there probably wasn't a lot of surprises. But what do you think, since becoming lead pastor, when you think about that job description or what it demands of your heart, what's changed in your understanding of it? Or what would you say, like, I knew this was part of it, but now I really understand the heart of this. Like there is that journey, I've been on it myself, of like, I knew I was called to be a pastor. I knew a lot of what it entailed. I saw it up close. But now, like in it, if I was to define the job description, maybe on paper it looks very similar, but it's alive in my heart and mind in a different way. I'm just curious if you have any reflections at this stage in your journey of your just relationship to what it means to be a pastor today.
It could be so easy to be so mindful of the ministry, what it looks like, people's discipleship journey, what's the growth track, and all that stuff. I'm like, if I'm not good, this whole thing is not going to be good either. And I realized that really quickly. I mean, like us coming back from Australia, July 2019, jumping into executive pastor role, leading that church through COVID, like stepping into all that, having a kid in the mix of the pandemic, isolated in a 3.5 apartment in Griffintown, Montreal, feeling the pressure, the need. The whole world is screaming help from every side of it. And that was a moment where I was like feeling so overwhelmed and crushed down. And I'm like, what am I signing for? This is crazy. That's a wild ride. But still pursuing because you love the peeps so much. You love the church so much. You're like, somebody's got to do it, man. Somebody's got to do it. And so for me, the role was, and it's in that moment that self-care, prayer. Yeah, prayer. That's the word, man. Have a deep longing for God in prayer. I don't know if that's too simple, but actually, I was like, the prayer life of the pastor is probably the most foundational thing. So it's actually like every moment that I can, being aware of God, praying without hesitation. Every occasion, like the exercise with my wife of like, hey, somebody says, Pastor, can you pray for this? And we're like, yeah, we'll pray for that. And I'm like, no, let's pray now. Let's do it. Like the discipline to ask for God's intervention now. I feel for me, the greater need happened the moment I step into that role, that realization. I don't want to say that, but it's like in that role, I felt the same way that when it happened, my dad told me that's the experience he had. The moment I had the transfer happen, he felt a weight he never thought he had fell off his shoulder.
Oh, interesting.
It's like he felt literally physically, he felt as if his arms were floating.
Wow.
And I was like, I carried this for 50 years. Like every week I felt like I had to preach. I couldn't let the church go. I had to be there. With time he had a team, it was helpful.
Yeah.
But he's like, man, I felt a weight. And for sure, I don't want to carry the same weighty. And that I want to wear it with grace 100%. Like it's not all on me for the church to succeed.
But there's a unique burden when you step into that role.
Yeah, totally.
And it does kind of demand an upgrade, of your prayer life, of your
100%.
It's like, if you try to like ride off of the life architecture or depth of walk with God from the chapter before, and it's because God always wants a new thing too. Like he wants us deeper with him.
Totally. Yeah. So I think that was a big part of that. And unique to our situation, I've realized there is, to my understanding, I never planted a church. You could talk on that one, but never planted a church. I'm like, I don't feel I'm graced to plant one, but to take a church, you have to be willing to be more in love with the people than the vision of what you think the church should become.
Wow.
That was for me something I realized a year after stepping in. Like you come in with so much excitement. You're like, yes, Lord, you give me a vision of what the church could be. Oh, I can see it. Let's put it to work. And I'm driven. So I could be like, that's the plan. So in the next month, we're going to change that. And I'm like, but for the well-being of the people, that ain't good. Like the dream is not better than the people. Like you have to be willing to be like, my role is to serve them well. And I got to realize those people in that church have a journey. And my role as a pastor is to come alongside that journey with them. Wow. And maybe another church is somewhere else. Yeah. Good for them. But our church is at that place in that moment. And that was for me to be able to read the room, pray, be like, what do I feel God is leading us into as a church community? Other churches can be, it's like coming back to the village mindset for me. That was like, I got to come back I know the world is somewhere, but where are we in that story? Yeah. Because God, I feel, is writing specific something there. Not that we're the main character of it all, but we're part of his story, but still we are a character in that story. And to know like, what role do we play? And what role do I play with them that God is asking me to do? So for me, that was a lot of those things of like, for sure, there's things you got to do for the well-being of the church, things that require change, going to go pastoral journey, but there's other things you're like, not worth dying on a hill for. And even though I know it would be great, but it might take 10 years and I should be good with that. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ben, for your insights. You need to be willing to be more in love with the people than with your vision for what the church could become. That's a strong word for each of us. Before we move into our final conversation, here's a quick note from Generis, friends of the podcast who help make our production a reality.
We want to take a quick moment to thank Generis for partnering with us to make today's episode possible. Generis exists to help church leaders like yourself weave a culture of generosity into the fabric of your church. Now, we know any conversation about fundraising can feel awkward or tricky, but they don't have to. Generosity is essential to the mission of God in our churches. And Generis is all about coming alongside pastors to help foster healthy cultures of generosity so our churches can step into the mission God has for us. And here's how they do it. They take the time to understand the unique culture and story of your church. Then they take biblical principles and other proven strategies to build a tailored plan designed for your community. If you want to find out more, we want to introduce you to John Wright from their team. He was a pastor for many years, and now he's giving his time working with Generis and local churches. You can find John's email in the show notes of this episode.
Finally, we find ourselves in the small town of Gibsons, British Columbia, where Jason speaks with Jaz Ghag, a pastor whose journey into ministry began from a very different place. Jaz was raised in a Sikh family, and his journey to faith in Christ came at a great personal cost, including tension with his family and his cultural community. But over time, God drew him in, provided community, and opened the door to pastoral ministry. His story is one of courage, of resilience, and the deep call of Jesus to follow, no matter the cost. Here's Jaz and Jason.
I'd love to hear a bit about your story. You mentioned you grew up in the interior of BC, and your parents immigrated to Canada.
Yes.
Take us a little bit through your family story.
Sure. Yeah. So my mom and dad were arranged marriage. So they never met each other until they were pretty much married. And quite an interesting story of that. My dad was, I think, 21 when he came to Canada and went to work in Boston Bar on the railroad in the middle of winter.
What year around?
This would be like 70, 71.
Yeah.
So quite a thing, quite a transition from Punjab, India to
I bet
railroad tracks.
Wow.
And
for him, probably a vision to build a new life for himself and future generations.
Yeah, I've always been really, really amazed. Anyone that has come over from a totally different culture,
courage.
It takes amazing courage to come into a place where you don't really speak the language, you definitely don't know the culture, you don't know what to expect. It's completely foreign to you. And, they still live in the same community that they've been in. And so my dad transitioned into sawmill work and stayed there his entire career and became a millwright and did really well.
Good for himself.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Siblings?
I have a younger brother and younger sister. So I'm the eldest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're not part of a Christian family, but you came to faith. How did that happen?
Yeah. I grew up Sikh, and there's so many Punjabi people are Sikh background, and it's quite a faith. And I really was in my mid-teens trying to understand that, trying to, understand and uphold what it meant to be a Sikh. And, what I realized was it just seemed like it was lacking something. I wasn't connecting, and I thought, there has to be more to life than this. And it just caused me to go down a road of wanting to discover more.
So even as a teenager, sincere searching journey.
Yes.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And that led me to being invited.
It reminds me that teenagers are, not all, some are just playing video games, but most are not.
Right.
There's these deep questions and there's these wrestles, and so you're searching, and then what puts you on the scent?
Yeah, basically it was being invited by a fellow student, a friend who said, "Hey, would you come out to a youth thing?" And I thought, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll check it out." And just a classic gym night, sports night. And back in the days when youth groups had all different ages in the youth group. It wasn't just, this age and that age separate. And so I went to this thing and began to see one of two things were happening. They were being very nice to each other. They were having a great time. It was just a different atmosphere. And I thought, okay, I thought these people knew I was coming, and they all, thought, hey, let's be really nice. We'll get this guy.
Our best behavior tonight.
Let's get this guy in the club, or there's something really different.
Wow.
And that was kind of what began, because I really did honestly go, Jason, with that intention that if anyone tries to, hit me with a Bible, then I know that's their whole game, and I'll walk out and that'll be the end. But it never happened. And it began this journey of, okay, I'm going to just watch. I'm going to be an observer and see what these people are all about, because something was intriguing. And later in life, I realized that's the Spirit drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really special. And then not everyone has like a defining moment, but was there like a key moment or series of moments where you go, okay, I'm not just going to observe this thing with interest. I actually want to give myself over to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember being at a youth service, and again, sitting at the back, just observing and listening to this youth pastor talking about his lifestyle that he had come from before coming to Christ. And the question that he had asked, God, if you're real, prove it. And that just stuck with me. And it was a short number of months later, middle of the night, I'm out with a friend from youth group on our bicycles, riding around our little town. And we end up, down at the sidewalk of the local city hall. And I'm sharing with him some of the things that are going on in my life. And it was like the perfect timing, where he just turned and said, "Hey, Jaz, I think you need Jesus in your life." And at that moment I said, he said, you want to pray with me? I said, yeah, I'd love to pray with you. And that first thought that came to my mind was, God, Jesus, if you're real, show me.
Yeah.
And he did.
What was the experience then, telling your family, making sense of this new faith, different from faith practice in your household?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, because the next day I mentioned it to my folks. This is what's happened. And things hit the fan pretty hard, and had a vehicle full of my relatives show up from the Lower Mainland and sit me down. I'm 15 and a half, 16 years old, right? Sit me down around the kitchen table and have a very long conversation with me about how this is a big mistake. This is wrong. You're the oldest in the family. So there's a cultural dynamic going on there of don't disgrace your family like this.
Was there any shame
don't do this.
experienced in that?
Personally, it was more of a, wow, you're making a really big deal out of this.
Right.
The attempt was, I think, to, hey, we want to get you back on track.
Yeah.
And so after that ordeal, I kind of got excommunicated from my family.
Oh my goodness.
It was a wild experience. And my church, God bless them, love my home church, but they didn't really know what to do with that. And so I'd come and say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. And they're like, wow, we don't know what to say, but we'll pray for you. And thankfully I had a good youth group that was, I got very close to and connected to, and it really helped me through those years. But always just believe that, there's a cost to following Christ.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to pay that cost, then you can't follow Christ. And that was an interesting thing to learn at a young age. Yeah.
Your relationship with your family in the years that followed, was there reconciliation or integration?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a conversation, I remember a while later, with my dad, and he just said to me, if this is something that's helping you, then keep going, but don't ever forget your roots. And I remember distinctly still, that was many years ago, I said to him, why would I ever forget my roots? There's a richness, there's great benefit and strengths I would never forget. And that's the concern. I think people need to realize sometimes that when someone's coming from a different faith background, different cultural background, there's a lot of different things that they risk. And there's a lot of fears that people that care for them, love them, that don't understand Christ, they fear losing. And so a great testimony over all these years has been to just be there, stick, be there, don't disappear. Don't lose the background.
And then you decided somewhere along the line to not just keep following Jesus, but become a pastor.
And that's another great story.
Tell us.
Yeah. So I remember telling my parents a few years later, hey, I'd like to go to Bible college. And well, why would you want to do that? I said, I actually don't know.
At the time, it wasn't necessarily, I want to be a pastor. It was like, hey, I just need to keep going this direction.
I did not have a huge desire to be a pastor at all. And I didn't really understand why or whatever. It just wasn't a desire. But the Lord was very much like, you need to go. I was looking at some other career directions and just felt like, hey, as a young Christian, I need to be grounded in my faith. Anybody going into any vocation should, if you're a believer, be grounded in your faith. So this is a great idea. I should go to Bible college for a year. And I didn't have the money to go, and it's an interesting story. I love riding motorcycles. So I had a motorcycle that I loved this motorcycle. And I remember when I got it saying to the Lord, if you wanted me to get rid of this thing, no problem. I'd totally get rid of this.
Yeah.
And then you can imagine, I didn't let a speck of dirt onto this thing. Yeah. And it came down to, you're not going to get the student loan to go to school.
Wow.
You have to sell your bike. And, I thought, well, I don't know if I'll be able to do that. Well, sure enough, it's one of those stories. Someone shows up, knocks on your door and says, hey, I heard you're selling your bike. I'm like, where did you hear that? Long story short, I sell this bike, and it's enough for one semester.
Yeah.
And my parents are shocked.
Yeah.
Like, he's serious, because they're thinking, this guy's got no money.
They know how much you love your bike,
and that I don't really have the money at all, anyways, to go. So he's not. So they realize all of a sudden this guy's going, and so it's an interesting story, because now I don't have a vehicle at all, and I'm like, hey, can I get a ride to Bible college? And they're really not happy with this at all. So my dad goes to give me a ride to Bible college and drop me off there, and is quite shocked that that I'm going. And not only does he say, hey, actually, you should save the money you have because you'll need it for the next semester. I'll look after this semester. My jaw hits the ground. I'm going, what on earth? My Sikh father is helping me to go to Bible college. Like, I mean, if God isn't a God of miracles, I don't know what else to say about that.
That's really special to hear.
Yeah. And there was a series of things that happened after that. It was quite amazing. So I finished that first year of Bible college going, I think I need to come back. And about, 3 or 4 years later, I did come back and finished and argued with the Lord for a while. Like, what am I doing here, Lord?
Yeah.
And he says, don't worry about it. Just be faithful. Finish what I told you to finish, and I'll lead you to the next thing. And I was surrounded by people in school that really knew what they were wanting to do and where they wanted to go. And I like to know what I'm supposed to be doing as well. But I just wasn't getting that clarity. And so it wasn't until I finally stopped, asking the Lord about that and just said, oh yeah, I'll trust you're going to do what you're going to do.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat,
Well,
sharing your
thanks.
story about your family. And I just thank God for the way he grabbed hold of your life and your yeses along the way. Did you ever get your motorcycle back?
Finally, it took like 13 years and I've hung on to it. And so I still have it. I still have the same motorcycle. And so we have a lot of fun with it up here. We get all kinds of random people together from the Sunshine Coast once a year and from all around. And we do a big rally up to a place called Lund.
Where's Lund?
Lund is the end of the road when you go up past Powell River.
Okay.
It's a
so
cool
beautiful, man.
spot.
Wow.
Yeah. And so we get all kinds of people that, again, have nothing to do with the church. And we just hang out for the day.
I love it. Well, thanks for making time to chat today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pastorate. We hope that these stories encouraged you, not just as a pastor, but as a follower of Jesus. Whether you're in a season of momentum or just trying to keep your head above the water, our prayer is that you were reminded of this, that God is with you through it all. If this episode spoke to you, feel free to share it with somebody else in ministry who could use a bit of encouragement. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. You can rate and review this podcast on your preferred listening platform and follow along with us online and on Instagram at thepastorate.ca. Until next time, may you lead with courage, rest with intention, and stay rooted in the presence of Jesus. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.